Welcome to the fourth episode of the Breaking the Boundary podcast, sponsored by No Limits Productions. Michael, how's it going today, man?
Doing great. How about you?
Good. It feels good to get back in the studio. Had about a week off, but we're not joined by Bryce this week. But Michael and I are always here, ready to hit you guys with some hard hitting topics, as we like to say. But so this week we're focusing on something that's corporate social responsibility. Michael, you don't really have too much of a business background. You're a neuroscience major. Like, what do you think of corporate social responsibility?
Yeah, so I guess, as you said, I don't really know much, but I will start with what I know. I know that corporate social responsibility is sort of about companies stepping in to sort of fulfill societal roles, just sort of needs that the community can't meet itself. I know this sort of gained traction, in the 70s it got started, but now with the new digital age and things being a lot more accessible to a lot more people, it's become a topic that's really important to a lot of people and a lot of companies.
Yeah. So corporate social responsibility, it's really interesting whenever we examine it because, like you said, this theory started developing in like the 70s, and as time progressed and as technology progressed and people were able to become more interconnected, the idea that businesses should be doing more than just delivering profits became really, really focused on area of business. And we actually, here at UK, we have one of the leading researchers in corporate social responsibility, Professor Dr Peloza. I had the pleasure of interviewing him this week. And before we get into that interview, I want to talk about why we are talking about corporate social responsibility. So if you had to say one thing this podcast was focused on, it would be solutions, right?
Yeah.
So we're focused on solutions to social issues that come from business. Corporate social responsibility is the foundation of that. So for our listeners at home, we really hope that you enjoy this interview with Professor Peloza. Great guest, great guy, great professor to actually have him this semester. But yeah, just give this interview a listen.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome to episode 4 of the Breaking Boundary podcast, sponsored by No Limits Productions. We are honored today to bring on the Vernon William Smith Professor of Marketing, Professor Dr Peloza. Professor Peloza, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. Well, this episode is going to be about corporate social responsibility, which is something I know you have a lot of experience with. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your background and how you came to become an expert in corporate social responsibility.
Sure. My background, I have an undergrad business degree. And when I finished college, I went to work in the marketing communications industry, working on brands, and became interested in the research behind sort of the effects that I was trying to create, particularly in the nonprofit industry. I had some clients working in the charitable sector and found those challenges to be particularly interesting, given that they tended to not have a lot of money and had some pretty huge needs in terms of consumer behavior and some of the things that they were trying to accomplish. And so I became interested in those challenges and answering some of the questions about how those kinds of organizations could do a better job attracting resources to engage in their missions. So at the same time, I was teaching in a night class at the local university, and just got talking with the faculty one day, and they said, "Well, why don't you consider doing a PhD?" Which I never considered doing. Basically picking something to study for the rest of your life. And so I said, "Okay, I'm interested in this nonprofit stuff. Let me try that." And then slowly that morphed into kind of the corporate social responsibility side, taking the corporate perspective on social and environmental issues and how companies can engage with those kinds of issues. So that was almost 20 years ago now, and that's what I've been doing pretty much every day for a couple decades and counting now.
Awesome. Well, given that background, I guess just to lay the foundation for our conversation, you're the perfect person to ask this. But for our listeners, what is corporate social responsibility?
It's kind of one of the challenges in doing research in this area is it doesn't have a really clear definition. The one that I use, and the one that is, I think, generally in the right vein, is the discretionary allocation of corporate resources toward social or environmental outcomes, or toward social environmental issues. So it encompasses, pretty much every facet of business. If you think about how businesses impact and are impacted by social environmental issues, it encompasses the typical, charity donation type things, mitigation of pollution controls, human rights, employment practices, even to the degree to which companies can innovate with products and services that in and of themselves have environmental benefits. So environmentally friendly cleaners, fuel efficient vehicles, things like that. So it's pretty broad. It's generally, company activities that are designed to have positive social environmental outcomes.
Awesome. So obviously, since the beginning of American business, there's been a discretionary allocation of resources. But when did people start really focusing on corporate social responsibility as a facet of their business?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that it's sort of as old as business itself. If you think back to what companies would do, traditionally the corporate ownership structure was one person, historically. So you had Rockefeller and people like that who actually did have philanthropic activities and did have issues, but it was generally inseparable, a person from the company. So with the corporate structure, I would say it really started in the 60s, I would say, with broader social movements and in particular awareness of environmental issues. There were a couple of books that came out that were sort of really prominent in the early 60s on the environmental imperative and some of the things going on. No one really was talking about that. The size and scope of companies greatly increased through the 1900s. If you think about globalization and the impact that businesses had, the size of business increased. So, through the latter part of the second decade is really when it became mainstream. Certainly the research side of it really started in earnest in the 50s and 60s. The initial outcomes, but it's as a discipline, I would say about 50 to 60 years old now. So it's still fairly young relative to economics or other kind of what I would call fields of business or inquiry types of inquiries.
Yeah. So something for our listeners, I actually became acquainted with Professor Peloza because I have him in class. And one of the things that really stood out to me about classes during our discussions about corporate social responsibility is there were two theorists, Freeman and Friedman, and they basically had two semi-opposing views on corporate social responsibility. Freeman had more of a stakeholder-centric view, and Friedman was definitely all about returning those profits to shareholders. Why do you think that was a pioneering part of the milton social responsibility movement, just academic research opposing each other in that way?
Yeah, Milton Friedman was one of the famous proponents of what we call shareholder capitalism. So make as much money as you can and give that money to shareholders, and then they can go do what they will do with the money. And that the famous article where he talked about the social responsibility of business to maximize profits was 1970. So really kind of in response to some of those early couple of decades where companies were starting to get involved in social issues. And he kind of said, wait, time out, this is not right. And then, that really kind of dominated some of the early thinking. Certainly early corporate thinking was essentially profit maximization and shareholder value maximization. Mm-hmm. And then Ed Freeman, in the early mid 80s, became well known for what's called stakeholder theory or stakeholder capitalism, which is really not, to me, it's no different than Friedman. But what he's saying is, managing the needs of stakeholders, of all the stakeholders of the firm, so customers, employees, suppliers, not just shareholders, is the right way to run a business. The two largely, I think can be reconciled in the sense that even Milton Friedman said, if there's a reason, a business benefit that you can accrue to, say, donating to charity, then it's fine. And so it really did spawn a lot of this research that's, literally been going for 50 years, asking the question, is social responsibility profitable? Is it good for business? Can it deliver shareholder value? Mm-hmm. And so the two aren't really diametrically opposed, although people generally think of them as different and two competing ways in which you can view the role of the firm in these issues.
Yeah. So I'd like to elaborate more about something you kind of touched on in your answer there. It's a little bit about the relationship between corporate social responsibility and profitability. A big focus of this podcast is exploring how business can be used as a tool to solve social issues, but in the same sense, not running a nonprofit organization to where your goal is still to produce positive net income. So Throughout your research, have you found a relationship between corporate social responsibility and profitability?
Yes, an asterisk beside it. There is a relationship. If you look historically, the meta-analyses that combine decades of research and hundreds of thousands of data points in context show that there is overall a small positive correlation between the two. But there's a lot of unpacking that's still it's happening now around causality. I mean, that's the first question: is do companies who are more profitable then do more things, or does doing more things lead to more profit? There's evidence that both are true. So that's the first issue. The second issue is the causality. We touched on this before. What are you talking about when you talk about CSR? If you're talking about fuel efficient vehicles, of course, yes, you can sell things very profitably that have positive impacts relative to perhaps something like charity donations, which has a looser relationship. So there are studies that do show that these initiatives do have positive impacts on stakeholders, customers being the biggest one, but it's not an absolute relationship. It's certainly contextual. It's moderated by different factors. So it is a positive relationship, but it's like everything in business. It has to be managed accordingly so that you're kind of understanding how stakeholders are responding to these initiatives and what outcomes you're expecting.
Gotcha. So in that kind of same sense, talking about how it's kind of tough to examine a relationship, how do companies track and measure their corporate social responsibility?
Ooh, well, their activities are easy enough to measure. So you'll have, for example, how much did we donate to charity? How much emissions did we reduce? So what's our carbon footprint? And they'll set targets to either increase or decrease depending on what it is. And so they'll report on those outcomes in virtually all large companies now have CSR reports or sustainability reports where they'll track those things. And so it is now reported very much the way financial statements are done. Every year a company produces an annual report. Most large companies also produce a CSR report. And so they do look at those things, and they'll set objectives like they do for any other part of business. And those will change over time and they'll adapt. The issue really is that companies traditionally haven't done a good job, and it's difficult to do, of measuring the outcomes of those initiatives. So we did all these things. We had employee volunteers. We do things in our supply chain. How are we impacting society? How are we impacting the environment? And how are we impacting the stakeholders that we're trying to develop relationships with? Some of my research looks at the general public's perception of companies and their CSR, and we find that it's largely misaligned. And so the company's actual performance, according to their CSR report, what they're doing isn't what people often think that they're doing. Some cases it is, but in a lot of cases, companies don't give enough credit, if you will, to companies that are doing a lot of good things, or they'll give too much credit to companies who really aren't doing all that much. And so there's a number of things in which they could track. They're good at tracking what they're doing and reporting those things. It's less clear how they've been able to track sort of outcomes and things that they expect to see from those initiatives.
Gotcha. So it may be difficult to track those outcomes, but what kind of tangible benefits does the world receive from corporate social responsibility? And also, what kind of benefits beyond profit can a business receive by being responsible in this way?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, the first one is what there's incredible benefits if you think about the impact that companies have on the planet and on society. Everything from disaster relief. Companies are very active in disaster relief, which is a very acute, immediate sort of benefit to societies. They'll do longer term mitigation of pollution environments. The innovation that companies do, if you think about the efficiency of of vehicles, I mean that's companies have innovated. Tesla is innovating and doing all these kind of things. So the impact is extreme in terms of what companies can do or what they are doing. The impact they're having. In terms of the impact that they're having on stakeholders, I believe that was your second question.
It's what businesses, what benefits can a business receive beyond profit from being
Right. Yeah. I mean, they all, they all can be tracked back to financial performance if you think about the kind of ways that this impacts. So, broadly speaking, CSR will impact the relationships that companies have with their stakeholders. So that could be customers, for example. So if a customer thinks, okay, you're a good company, I'm glad you're donating to charity. Maybe I'll be more loyal. Maybe I'll pay a little more, or I'll forgive you if there's a negative story. And so, that doesn't necessarily lead to profits, but it certainly has a theoretical relationship. Same thing with employees. Some research shows that companies that are engaged in CSR and have a culture of CSR are also more innovative. And so, there are cultural effects to this. It can enhance relationships with governments, and so you can have maybe a little more free space to operate if you have a positive reputation for CSR, where governments are more welcoming to say, you can operate in our communities because you're a good citizen, or you're a steward of the stakeholder needs in our communities. And so all of those things are what I call the mediating factors. If you think about CSR and profit as kind of, okay, how does this impact this? The mediation typically works through those kind of stakeholder relationships. And so firms that expect to see a financial relationship between their CSR initiatives from their CSR initiative will manage those accordingly. And so I'll invest in things that I think my customers will like. I'll invest in things that my employees care about because I want to be, have a good relationship with my employees. But a lot of companies, aren't very good at managing that. They just want to sort of, be a good company. And so that's great. I mean, so it's to some extent the degree to which you are motivated by those relationships versus not. Companies that donate to charity, and one of the challenges with research is, we don't know why companies are doing it. If you ask a company why they do these things, they say, well, it's a good thing. Of course we do these things, and it's also good for business. And so, a lot of companies donate because it's a good thing to do and they feel good about it. So, I never want to impugn the motives of a manager who talks about CSR and say, oh, you're just doing it because, you want to look good. I mean, people generally want to do good things. And so I think companies, just do things not to get something back necessarily. Part of it is the people there feel good about being able to have a positive impact.
Yeah. So another interesting thing, like you mentioned, there's this gap between perception and reality when it comes to CSR. So is the financial benefit of CSR, is it more dependent on how much CSR you're doing or how well you're able to market that CSR towards states?
Well, yeah, here again, we have the form of CSR that I think is the biggest impact, the biggest factor here, because, how you're promoting CSR, obviously if people don't know what you're doing, they can't react to it. But even that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a benefit. So if you think about UPS, for example, I believe a while ago had converted their trucks to a more fuel efficient source. They have idle-free, so they do things to reduce costs because generally speaking, reducing environmental impact also has potential to reduce costs. And so, I mean, I like that example because it suggests that you don't always have to market your CSR to get benefit from it, because I don't think anyone's choosing UPS as a courier because of because of their fleet. But and they don't, I mean, they would market it. I'm sure people would like it, but I'm not sure it's a big factor. So for that company, it's a matter of reducing cost and sort of the impact of what they're doing in the operations. And so it isn't necessarily something that's marketed, but there are components certainly that do benefit from those kinds of communication practices where, people can't give you credit or reward you if they don't know what you're doing. So it is probably the largest limitation, is that companies don't do enough to talk about these things. It's a double-edged sword though, because people generally don't like it when people brag about their good deeds. It's not something we're supposed to do. It gets back to that motive idea. How do you tell somebody what a great company you are without sounding like you're bragging and just trying to get credit? You're doing it because you want to look good, not because you really care. So it's a delicate thing for a lot of companies to do.
Yeah. Speaking of the motivations, there's multiple motivations for CSR. There's building the brand image. There's just personal conviction. There's cost saving. Does the motivation behind CSR matter in the terms of how people perceive it? Or is it just CSR in the eyes of consumers?
as it's perceived by consumers, for example, motive is very important. Certainly for some parts of CSR or forms of CSR. So if you think about donations to charity, you have to do it for the right reasons, or people will actually hate you more. You're better off not to do it at all if you're doing it for the wrong reasons. A tobacco company got into hot water some time ago because they ran a campaign to try to get teens to stop smoking. They invested in some of these things, and then ran a campaign talking about their investment, and the communications talking about the program was 3 times as expensive as the program.
Oh my goodness.
And so that was a clear example of, okay, you're really not trying to change things, you're just trying to look good. And so in that case, it does matter a lot. But in other cases, if you think about fuel efficient vehicles or hybrids or electric vehicles, for example, the motive isn't as important, because when a customer is buying something, they tend to look at what's the value creation. And so I think companies still can and do talk about the fact that they like to make the planet a better place. Toyota talks about the Prius and their hybrids as very much as we're helping the planet. So I think all those forms of value are relevant, but I think they go up or down in importance depending on what kind of CSR activities we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So with CSR, I feel like there's been just a renewed focus on a business's social impact. Do you think the internet has anything to do with that? The internet's ability for businesses to be held instantly accountable in the eyes of millions of people across the country and in the world?
Yeah, I think it's had an incredible impact, as it has in every part of life, really. The same kind of things. We saw some of the issues of CSR, and we started the conversation. In the era of globalization, through the 50s and 60s, those kind of things started to come up, where you said all of a sudden a company operating in Southeast Asia with all kinds of other issues, and often those things weren't known, because if you're sitting in Des Moines, Iowa, as a customer, you have no idea what's going on in Indonesia at their facility. And so, increased globalization, communication has been a big part of shrinking that world, and getting information out to literally billions of people. So the broad effect of the internet, and in particular social media, where you have groups of stakeholders and people who are of interest coming together and sharing this information, where you really can't, you can't hide from things like you used to be able to do maybe in the 60s or 70s, when you could just sort of have something and nobody knew about it, or very few people knew about it, because it was just very much a smaller world now.
Yeah, especially with the internet, I wonder if businesses have been incorporating CSR more into brand image. Is that becoming more popular among businesses?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've done some research projects. In particular, we were looking at the 2008 recession, and we found that companies were actually maintaining or actually increasing the amount of communication they were doing with CSR. The issue is that they're coming from a pretty small base, and so there still isn't a lot of communication about CSR, but they certainly are doing more of it. And even through economic downturns, they're saying that this isn't how maybe it used to be perceived as sort of, okay, well, when times get tough, we cut these things and don't do these. I think companies are seeing it now as more of this is just part of our business, and it's not a discretionary thing like it might have used to have been. It's discretionary in terms of what you do and where you invest those dollars, but it's really no longer a question of whether or not a company can do activities related to CSR. Every company, I think, says we have to be engaged. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of what we're going to choose and how we're going to do it.
Gotcha. So taking the conversation a little bit of a different direction, I come from a finance background, and I always, in the realm of this, I kind of always thought of environmental social governance. I kind of saw a little bit of a tie between ESG and CSR. Do you see a tie there? And what is that relationship like?
It was very much tied. I mean, when I said, CSR is tough to define, part of it is it's used, a lot of different terms are used. There's corporate citizenship, there's the triple bottom line. ESG, is a very common term used in CSR land. So it is very tight. I mean, obviously the environmental social sides of it are there. The governance side is really, the one that's, I think, sort of often excluded from CSR, but it is, it is a factor if you think about the way a company manages stakeholder expectations and it addresses wider stakeholder needs. The governance part of it really, I think, is most closely tied to the heart of stakeholder theory, which is, how do we make decisions? But the governance side really, it's often not. I know it's big in the finance literature, but as someone who works more in the marketing literature, my work tends to look at consumer behavior and how consumers respond. Consumers, for the most part, really don't know any of that stuff and really don't want to know. The assumption is if you're doing things on the environmental and social side, that the governance sort of gets a halo and says, well, you're probably doing a good job there too. You're probably doing the right things. You're probably having good external voices. You're doing the things that you should do to be a well-run company or a properly run company.
So with corporate social responsibility, there's a lot of businesses that are well known that practice it pretty publicly. I know Patagonia, for one, is really well known for their CSR activity. Are there any other businesses that maybe college students would be familiar with that are known for their CSR activity and we've never really connected that in our brains that, hey, this company's doing a lot of good socially as well as the products that we're buying or services we're receiving?
Well, the ones that tend to be picked up are like you mentioned, there are a few that are, like poster children for CSR. So Patagonia is a huge one. Tom's Shoes, of course, the buy one, give one. Ben and Jerry's often gets used. There are some typical ones that are there, some typical brands that people think about. But there are, if you look at I've done some research that looks at, comparing perceptions and actual performance. And you can find companies that you often don't think about as being particularly socially responsible, but they actually are. And so most people really can't tell you the names of companies that are socially responsible or have associations, or if they do, it's sort of an idiosyncratic, like, okay, I know this. I went to Chipotle, I'm standing in line and there's a sign that says, here's all this locally sourced thing we're doing. And so I'm aware of it because I'm exposed to it. But consumers, for the most part, don't go seek out this information. And so there are a lot of brands doing a lot of things, but you have to go dig to find it. If you go to the website, you can always find those CSR reports and all that information, but it generally doesn't make the list. And so you end up with a few of these brands, like I mentioned, that people tend to think about very quickly and easily associate them with CSR. But the larger ones, most people don't have associations in any particular way on that front. They'll think of McDonald's as being, a cheap place to get food and it's quick and the kind of things that McDonald's wants you to know about them. And might think about Ronald McDonald House maybe more so than, Burger King or, competitors that don't have something high profile like that. But those are pretty rare. Most cases, people don't really tend to that information very much.
So how can young consumers access that information? You mentioned company websites and CSR reports. Is there any other way that's like, I don't want to say more convenient, but just accessible?
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem. Is there are almost too many ways. If you Google, top CSR companies, there's no shortage of organizations that will put out lists of top companies, and they all have different methodologies. They all have different geographic focuses. And so you'll end up with all kinds of strange names that why is that on the list? And so the methodology, what I find is that consumers, it's not so much, let me find out what this company's doing. They say, this is an issue that I care about, and then we'll go find out what that company's doing on that issue. And they'll choose companies based on an issue that's relevant to them. But if there's no issue that's relevant to you, then often people don't go. If you're interested, of course, the easiest place is go to a website and find that information. Every large company has that information available, but typically it's done through people who are interested in issues. And back to the earlier point, on the internet and social media, that's where those issues are discussed. So if you're into animal rights, it's very easy to find discussions where you can easily find, okay, here are two companies that are doing great things. Don't buy from this company because they're doing terrible things. So usually that kind of information gets shared around on an issue basis and in forums like Facebook and places like that, where that's where I would guess most of your viewers would be exposed to these kinds of issues. but that, you have to sort of want to go find that. You have to be interested in that issue to sort of be entered into those conversations or to find those conversations.
So we really appreciate your time today. I've got one more question. So with this podcast being focused on solutions and we have a younger skewed audience, how would you recommend young entrepreneurs that are interested in implementing CSR, how would you recommend they go about that?
Well, that's a really great question. It's a big question. One of the things that we're trying to do here, and I know other schools are doing it as well, just from a college perspective, trying to create entrepreneurs, is to match the skills that people in business schools would have who are sort of looking to become entrepreneurs, matching those people with this, their counterparts in computer science or engineering or, other endeavors where there's a complementary skill set, where you really can look at products and services as the heart of CSR and the entrepreneurship. It's easy enough to say, I want to start a shoe company or an apparel company, and I want to be a good shoe company, or a good apparel company. That isn't particular. I don't want to say it's not hard, but it's easy enough because you have what you want to do. A lot of the really interesting opportunities in CSR are going to be the innovations that come from goods and services that are launched that typically, people in our College of Business, for example, have ideas, but then need to go find the expertise. And so one of the greater or more memorable projects was a group had an idea for an app that was going to help consumers find the information that you were just asking about. How do I know who's good on these issues? Bridging that knowledge gap. But it required app development, it required computer science. The idea that someone doesn't know what's possible technologically, has a vision and a direction, but doesn't necessarily know what they don't know, if you know what I mean. And so I think that's probably the biggest part, is to find complementary skill sets that can help you lead to interesting innovation that's going to make a social or environmental impact.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time today. This has been a great conversation, really informative. I'm sure our listeners are going to love it. But just thank you so much, Professor Peloza.
You're welcome. I'm happy to talk about it.
So, as we were talking about in that interview, CSR has been gaining a lot of popularity recently. So CSR just relates to what a business does to fulfill social need beyond the scope of just profitability. It can be motivated by a lot of things. Obviously, there's bottom line business growth that can motivate it. There's cost cutting, but there's also just personal convictions that business managers may have that motivate them to pursue corporate social responsibility goals. And a lot of companies want to utilize CSR more because it's a lot more popular among younger generations like us that they're trying to directly market towards. Michael, can you think of any companies off the top of your head that might have a really big CSR focus?
Yeah, I know a lot of people. I've heard of Tom's, who sort of created, the 1-for-1 platform. When someone buys a pair of shoes, they donate it to someone in need. But another company sort of following the same sort of structure is Bombas.
Yeah, I love Bombas socks.
Yeah, they're the most comfortable socks in the world,
Yeah.
But what Bombas does is basically the same thing as Tom's. Whenever someone buys a pair of socks, they donate a pair to someone in need in a different country. And you see sort of a different structure, but the same sort of idea with Warby Parker, the glasses company.
Yeah.
So what they do, instead of just, giving a pair of glasses when you buy one, is they go into other countries and they train people on how to administer eye exams and how to sell cheap glasses. So they sort of find a way at the same time to make profit for themselves while helping out people in lower income countries.
Yeah, that's the key to it, really, is utilizing business in the pursuit of profit, utilizing business as a tool to further society, or to minimize your impact on society if it's a negative impact. Like the company Lego, we all grew up playing with Legos.
Oh, yeah.
But Lego has recently announced that they're going to be contributing $150 million to reducing their waste because hard plastics aren't the best for the environment. And I really think businesses finding things within their own business model that can make them more sustainable and more socially responsible, it's really where we're headed in the future.
No, exactly. And I mean, you see companies like Walmart. Walmart in 2020 had almost $600 billion in revenue.
It's crazy.
That's more than like the government budget for a lot of really small countries out there. So if we could start getting this money allocated towards just even some of it, just get it allocated towards helping the environment, helping people in need. Just there's no telling what could happen.
Yeah. So, like Professor Peloza mentioned, the attitudes of business towards corporate social responsibility is changing. Businesses are recognizing the need to do more than just deliver profit to shareholders. They're recognizing the need to shift their focus a little bit towards stakeholders, their customers, their employees, society as a whole. And we really take that as a welcome change. With this podcast specifically geared towards seeing business as a tool for social change, CSR really is the future. And thank you guys for tuning in. Michael and I appreciate your time today. We really enjoyed recording this episode, researching this episode. So we'll catch you guys on our next episode. Thank you.
All right, see you next time.